The non-Jewish world respects us tremendously when we are strong in our convictions around our commitment to Torah and to Judaism, as we'll learn from an interesting story in the Gemara, which actually relates to the law that we're not supposed to eat food that is cooked solely by non-Jewish people. We're not even supposed to use the utensils in which those foods were cooked. And that's going to be something we learn from this week's parasha. But again, from the prohibition against eating food that has been cooked by a non-Jewish person. The Gemara in Avodah Zara learns it b'derech hasmachta from the support of, although it's not a direct prohibition in the Torah, from the pasuk where Moshe proposed to Sichon that they should have safe passage through his land, he said, that I'll buy food and I'll buy water from you. Says the Gemara, we learn from this, from here we learn that just like water is something you could drink without having to boil it first, so any food which you could eat raw without having to cook it, you don't have to worry if it is cooked by a non-Jewish person. So in that halacha is the Aprukta division. Poiskim, there are two views according to the halachic authorities. If I have vessels, utensils, containers that were used to cook food, used by a non-Jewish person to cook food, and therefore obviously has absorbed some of that food into the actual vessel. So if it was treif food, we know the vessel would be considered treif. Is it the same if the food was kosher food, just cooked by a non-Jewish person? That's the debate. One version, one view and opinion is as vibaldi issa from Bishul Nochim is mishum chasnos, seeing as the only reason we're not supposed to eat food cooked by a non-Jewish person is to put one more barrier between Jews intermarrying, because eating and socializing together brings people to the point where they may become friendly and even marry. So if that is our concern, we are not worried that if there was some stored flavor of the food inside the vessel and it's now going to re-enter the food that's put next into the vessel, that's not something that's going to bring people together and create intermarriage, so we shouldn't worry about it. That's one view. However, we're going to go with the majority view, which is the vast majority of opinions hold that if something was cooked, kosher food was cooked by a non-Jewish person in a container, that container is now considered non-kosher. Why? Because the moment that the sages declare something to be non-kosher, even what is later the flavor, the residual flavor that emerges from that food into a new food would also be considered non-kosher. We could say that this is actually similar to another halacha, completely unrelated, but shares a similar principle. If you have planks of wood which are too wide to be kosher for schach of a sukkah, even if you took those slats and you turn them this way, so they're now sitting vertically, and they're not too wide halachically to be a problem for schach, still zayin ze posel, they would still be disqualified as schach, because once a particular product has been classified as being unsuitable for schach, it doesn't matter which way you position it, it is unsuitable for schach. Similar thing over here. Once something has been declared non-kosher, it doesn't matter in what state it is non-kosher. And we'll see this even more clearly based on the Ragachova's explanation. The Ragachova is masber. As dosi is valazach was dosi mitzad gezeira zu leben ander zach welche is osur. So the Ragachova says, let's say you have something which is declared by the rabbis to be unfit or unsuitable, like this schach. We're worried that if you put a whole lot of planks next to each other, it's actually going to be a roof, not schach. Once that gezerah is in place, then those items are not just forbidden from being used as schach because of the technical possibility of making a roof, but they become fundamentally disqualified from schach. Even if the reason doesn't technically apply, we'll say the same thing with regards to the food that was cooked by a non-Jewish person. Yes, the logical motivation why we don't want to allow people to eat food cooked by non-Jewish people is because we want to limit the socializing so we don't have intermarriage. Nevertheless, even in a scenario where the actual reason doesn't apply, once the food has been declared non-kosher, it is always non-kosher when produced by a non-Jewish person. And so the prohibition against eating that food or the residual taste of that food in new food is in place even if the scenario is not an intermarriage scenario. So what are we saying? That even if this particular case, there's no way in the world it could bring to intermarriage, still the food is considered inedible for a Jewish person. It's not kosher, and we'll see that based on this intriguing story the Gemara tells us. So a possible source for this view is von dem Sipur was wird gebracht in Siyum Masechta Avodah Zara. This sikha is also a siyum Masechta Avodah Zara. Right at the end, we quote a story where the Gemara in context was talking about how you go about kashering a knife that had been used in food products that were cooked by a non-Jewish person, and you now want to use this knife for something which is a cold item. Now, if the reason that this knife is problematic in the first place is because it was involved in food that was cooked by a non-Jewish person, that will help us to deal with a number of issues in the story that really don't seem to make sense. So we've got to keep this thing in mind, that the psak is, if an item was used in cooking food for a non-Jewish person, the item has the status of being non-kosher, even if the specifics of maybe this will lead to intermarriage are irrelevant in this particular story. So let's have a look at the story, and then based on that, we'll answer some questions that arise in the story. So Mar Yehuda or Bati Bar Tuva have a Yasv Kamed Shavar Malka. There were two individuals. Mar Yehuda, we don't know, that could be Rabbi Yehuda, as the Rebbe will propose later, and a fellow called Bati Bar Tuvi, who is in an interesting stage of his life. He had been a slave, and he had been partially, and we'll see what partially means, released from slavery. They're sitting in front of Shavar Malka, who was a king who had a very close relationship with the Jewish people. So they brought an esrog for them to eat. So Shavar Malka sliced himself a piece of the esrog and he ate it. Then then he sliced another piece of esrog and he offered it and gave it to this Bati Bar Tuvi to eat. And then he took the knife and he thrust it 10 times into the ground, which is one of the things the Gemara said in that particular context, that one of the ways you kasher a knife that is non-kosher is you thrust it into hard ground 10 times, and that's what he did. And only after that, then he gave a piece of esrog to Mar Yehuda. So Bati Bar Tuvi was a little bit offended. So Bati Bar Tuvi says to Shavar Malka, says, what, am I not Jewish? You only kashered the knife for Mar Yehuda, not for me? So Shavar Malka says, well, actually, there's two versions of what he said, and basically says, I don't hold you at that same level as Mar Yehuda. Basically, I know the status of Mar Yehuda and his principles, and I don't know yours. As Rashi says, Rabbi Yehuda I know that Rabbi Yehuda is somebody who's really strict and he's never going to eat something which is non-kosher, therefore I kashered the knife for him. But you, I'm not so sure of. I don't know that you hold of the same standard, and that's why I wasn't necessarily worried on your behalf. Or, the other version is, Amalei says, Bati Bar Tuvi, really? You're worried about the esrog that's been cut with my knife? Don't you remember what you did last night? What happened the previous night, says Rashi. Part of the hospitality of the Persians was to give a female companion to their guests for the night. So when they sent these women to their two guests, which is Bati Bar Tuvi and Rabbi Yehuda, Bati was happy to take the woman. Rabbi Yehuda lo kibel, and Rabbi Yehuda said, forget about it, I'm not getting involved in any of this, I'm a frum Jew. Okay, so Lenedik Bepashtus, the simple version of the story would indicate, is the Chelek zwischen die zwei Mandomars in dem End for Shavar Malka in dem. Why are there two versions of how Shavar Malka responded to Bati Bar Tuvi? Must be, you'd think, was seit dem ersten Entfer hat Shavar Malka gesagt, als nicht sicher, Bati is a Porish midavar as Isser. The first answer is, I don't know who you are, Bati Bar Tuvi. That's what Shavar Malka is saying. I don't know how frum you are, and that's why I wasn't so careful on your behalf to kasher the knife before I gave it to you. B'cha eini muchstak, I have no a predetermined status to associate with you. Whereas, and Leute Iked Amri is by him given about dos, as it's nit parish chule. Whereas the second version says, well, Shavar Malka is saying, actually know that you are not a frum guy because you took the woman last night. Remember what you did last night. That's what it would seem to be. Okay, so the first opinion says, I don't know how frum you are, and the second opinion, Shavar Malka is saying, I know how frum you're not. But it's not so simple to explain it that way. Because the fact, Bati Bar Tuvi was happy to transgress a prohibition in the Torah and take one of these Persian women for the night. If that is what happened in the first version of Shavar Malka's response to Bati Bar Tuvi, why does he keep it so neutral? I don't know how from you are. Well, if that's what happened last night, you know exactly how not from he is. Says and it would be really difficult to try and explain that the debate between the two versions of what Shavar Malka said is actually a debate about whether or not Bati Bar Tuvi actually took these women at night. That would be a real stretch. So there's a big question. If Bati Bar Tuvi has shown his true colors by being willing to spend the night with a Persian woman, why is Shavar Malka, according to the first version, just saying, I don't know your halachic or from status? Okay, so Tosfos wants to propose an answer. In a moment we'll see that it's actually a l'shitase, the two different views of Rashi and Tosfos about the status of a man in the position of Bati Bar Tuvi. So in Tosfos state, as Bati hat nit chote given. So Tosfos says, actually, what Bati did the night before was not illegal. The fact that he took these foreign or this foreign woman home with him. Valer is given an eved ketzas because he was a partial eved. What's a partial eved? Shemeukav get shichr. He had been released from whoever owned him as an eved, but hadn't yet received the document of freedom. When an eved is mutter be'isha nachris, Tosfos says that an eved, seeing as he still is an eved, at least partially, is permitted to have relations with a non-Jewish woman, so Bati Bar Tuvi hadn't transgressed the law. V'shloimar, as Rashi was v'avod nitas Bati is dermit nit bagagen kenisur. Now you'll notice Rashi doesn't say this. Rashi doesn't suggest that Bati Bar Tuvi hadn't transgressed anything. It must be because Rashi and Tosfos l'shitosayo azli have two thematic differences in how you look at the law of somebody who is in this nebulous in-between state of half released from being an eved and not completely released. Where do we see an example? How does a person land up in such a case? The Gemara Gittin tells us a story that there's an Eved who went missing, and the guy turns around and says, I give up. I don't ever expect to get him back as my Eved. Says the Gemara, so the Gemara says that the only way that he'll ever be able to be fixed, in other words, to live a normal life, is he'll need still to have a document. Yes, the guy said, I don't ever expect to get him back, so he's now no longer under my jurisdiction. He's no longer technically my eved, but he's still not a free person until such time as he has the document of freedom in his hand. Why? As Rashi Meforish. What does it mean? Ein lo takana, he has no way to live his life because bebas Yisrael, he can't marry a Jewish woman because he's still partially a slave. V'lo b'shivcha, but he can't marry a slave woman because he's partially emancipated. So he's in no man's land, and therefore, as far as Rashi is concerned, the man is stuck. He can never continue with his life, can never have any kind of a family until he has the document of emancipation. That's Rashi's view. But Tosfos dot lend nitvi Rashi. Tosfos has a different view there in that Gemara. Now, as einay takana bebas chorin ka'omar avol b'shivcha shori. Tosfos understands that when the Gemara says he has no takana, it means he has no way to be able to marry an ordinary Jewish girl, but he is still allowed to marry a slave girl because he's not not totally freed yet. So that difference of opinion between Rashi and Tosfos would apply to the story of this Bati Bar Tuvi. He has a person who's partially freed but hasn't yet got the documentation. As a das Rashi is a osir b'shivcha. According to Rashi, well, then he's not allowed to be with these Persian women or a shivcha or anything like that. And the das Tosfos is a mutter b'shivcha v'aderech ze b'nochris, whereas according to Tosfos, he actually is permitted to do so. And so his choices the previous night are not an indication that he's a bad person. Okay, if he's not a bad person, it's not moving like Pirshat Tosfos, then according to Tosfos' view, the whole story makes no sense. If Bati did nothing wrong because he was technically permitted to be with a Persian woman, so then why is Shavar Malka throwing that in his face and saying, well, the reason I didn't kasher the knife for you is because look what you did last night. Well, he was allowed to do it apparently, at least according to Tosfos. So the Ritva is masbid. The Ritva wants to explain. Shavar Malka lohoya yodeya ze. Shavar Malka didn't know this technical detail of the halacha. And therefore, because Shavra Malka wasn't a big Talmud Chacham, even though he was somebody who knew halacha, as we shall see. He's not sure. Listen, maybe he's just like he's not so careful about the non-Jewish women. Maybe he's also not so careful about non-Jewish food products. And that was actually not correct, because even if a person is an Eved, they still are bound by all the prohibitions of the Torah. Says the Ritva, just like an Eved would not be allowed to eat chazer or meat that had not been shechted properly, he would not be allowed to eat food that was cooked by a non-Jewish person, but Shavra Malka didn't know that. Okay, problem with that explanation is it's not a clear explanation, because do you know who Shavra Malka was? Shavra Malka is Dochiv and Aboki Bedinim. The Gemara actually, what at least Rashi and Tosas point out in Bava Metzia, that Shavra Malka, who was very close to the Jewish people, actually knew quite a lot of halacha. This is actually, the story we're reading tells us that he knew things about halacha. How many non-Jewish people know that a Jewish person shouldn't eat from their kelim? And how many of them know how to kasher the kelim? Is nit mistaver as or nit gewusst im Dina as an Eved is mutter benochris. It does sound like a little bit of a stretch that a person with that amount of knowledge of Judaism would be unaware that a person who is a slave is allowed to marry a non-Jewish person. That's actually it should have been a fairly well-known thing at that time. Certainly better known than how to kasher a knife. So ich schwer zu sagen, also hat nicht gewusst, as Bati is noch an Eved Ketzas, and we cannot try and excuse Shavra Malka by saying, oh, he didn't know Bati's status, that he was an Eved, or partial Eved, because the Gemara famously tells us in Kiddushin that Rabbi Yehuda made a big deal about it and a huge announcement, and even criticized Bati Bar Tovi, saying, the reason he's still partially a slave is because he was a little bit too full of himself to accept the get shikhr that was given to him. So it was probably well known. Question is, why does Shavra Malka make this issue? Either saying, I don't know how from you are, which indicates that he was okay in his behavior, according to the other opinion, look what you did last night. It doesn't make sense. There are other things about the story that also don't make sense. Certain of the details. Bati hat genommen dem Esrog von Shavra Malka und wie es ist manchmal von Siprates gegessen. Okay, we can understand that Bati Bar Tovi accepts the slice of esrog that Shavra Malka gives him, and he probably ate it too. And we can explain why he did that. He didn't accept a piece of esrog and eat it because he wasn't so frum, or because he didn't care about Bishul Akum, or because he was ignorant of the fact that you're not supposed to eat food from, or food cut with a utensil used to cook non-kosher, kosher things, but by a non-Jewish person. Just look at his response to Shavra Malka. He said, what, am I not Jewish? He's moving as obviously he was aware of the halacha and it bothered him. So if it bothered him, why did he agree then afterwards to eat it? We'll think about the context. He's sitting in front of a king. Can you imagine the chutzpah? King offers you a piece of esrog. You say, sorry, I'm not eating from you. Your kashrus is not good enough for me. That is skating on the edge of rebellion against the king, which is a capital offense. And that would mean that Bati Bar Tovi would put his life on the line for a piece of esrog. Well, Pikuach Nefesh overrides all the mitzvahs of the Torah except for the 3 cardinal mitzvahs. So you don't sacrifice your life for a piece of esrog given to you by the king. You eat it, even if you're offended at the fact that he doesn't think you're Jewish enough. And you might still think, hey, hang on a second. He notices that Shavra Malka looks out for Rabbi Yehuda and doesn't give him the esrog until he's kashered the knife. And that bothered him to the extent, what am I not Jewish enough? So, you might wonder why Shavra Malka looking out for Rabbi Yehuda, not for Bati Bar Tovi. Well, you can understand that very simply, because probably Rabbi Yehuda presented himself obviously as a greater person. But Shavra Malka's decisions and behavior, so we can work out what's going through Bati Bar Tovi's mind and why he wants to protect his skin and eat the piece of esrog. But what's going through Shavra Malka's mind? Three questions. Aleph. Look, we can see that Shavar Malka is concerned about causing a Jewish person to transgress. That's why he kashes the knife before he cuts the slice for Rabbi Yehuda. So now, if in the first version of the story, Shavar Malka is just not so sure how from Bati Bar Tovi is, lo kimli begave, as Bati is a parishment devar iser. He doesn't know if he's really somebody who's so careful about prohibitions. Is that enough reason for Shavar Malka to offering something which is not kosher for him? In other words, you concern Shavar Malka about Rabbi Yehuda, so you don't want to give him the esrog. You're not so sure about Bati Bar Tuvi, so you give him the esrog. Why not protect him too? And even if you go with the second version of the story, which is he was aware of the fact that Bati Bar Tuvi does not adhere to the law so closely. As Bati at sich overgiven an Isabur to Tzibiamis Shitas Rashi, Adonoladash Shavar Malka Shitas Atosvis. Let's go with the second version. That either Bati Bar Tuvi did something wrong by being with the Persian woman the night before, Rashi's view, or Shavar Malka thought he did something wrong because he didn't necessarily know the nuance of Tosfos. Okay, so he did something wrong. It doesn't make any sense. Two wrongs. Just because he transgressed last night's behavior isn't a reason to cause him to transgress again or to excuse causing him to transgress again today. Especially when you consider what the two types of transgressions are. Maybe Bati Bar Tuvi just could not withhold himself from that tremendous temptation of this Persian woman. And he could still have kept kosher. Unfortunately, these things happen. Now listen to this incredible perspective. Bati Bar Tuvi could have defended his behavior because to have a one-night stand with a non-Jewish woman, niter chasnos, without having a long-term marital type relationship, be'etzina, when nobody could see it, is eisa derabanan. Is actually only a rabbinic prohibition. And maybe that's why he was able to justify in his own mind that it's only rabbinic and therefore acceptable. Whereas eating food that comes from non-Jewish utensils is prohibited by the Torah. Maybe actually Bati Bar Tuvi was too wise too smart for his own good. And he came up with a concoction of, that's a rabbinic law, I'm willing to transgress it. This is a Torah law, I'm not willing to transgress it. So Shavar Malka should have considered that and, don't say because he messed up last night, therefore I have license to give him something non-kosher to eat today. And lastly, die Tmia is noch starker. The craziest part of the story is the bottom line is Shavar Malka does kasher the knife for Mar Yehuda. So kasher the knife 3 minutes earlier, 1 minute earlier, 30 seconds earlier. Before you give bati from the esrog, you're going to kasher the knife anyway. What's the difference? Why dafka give him the treif and then kasher the knife? On the mitzvah, he could have also prevented Bati from transgressing. Why? What motivated Shavar Malka to first give the fruit to Bati, then kasher the knife, and then give to Mar Yehuda, as a Zodafka Esen Advar Yisur, which kind of guarantees that Bati is going to eat something non-kosher. So to understand all of this, is given nicht mit Zadem Acholis Asuros Bichlal, was hat belehr given in Bayis von Shavar Malka. As the Rebbe frequently does, the Rebbe says, let's just picture the scene from a practical perspective. Let's not get caught up in all the theoretical halacha of it and ignore the practicality of it. The problem with this knife is not what you think. There's no treif in this knife. We're talking here about a king. A king has an abundance of everything that he needs. So it would be ridiculous to suggest as if zu schneiden Peres Esrog hat man genutzt das Sakin mit welchem hat sich benutzt für tafshile Bosser Retech v'chulei. There is no way that in the royal palace they use the same knife to cut fruit that they use to cut meat, hot meat. That's not a sign of wealth if you're reusing. You've got a knife for fruit, you've got a knife for meat. Sicher, seinen dort zu die Peres gewähnt besondere Sakinim. There must have been special paring knives for fruit. So there's no treif in this knife, that's for sure. They never cut it, they never cut treif meat with it. Okay, so why are we concerned about the knife? And even Shavar Malka is. Now the second is given also vitzad bishulei nachrim. Going back to the original point we mentioned at the beginning of the Sikha, according to the majority of opinions, if you have used a utensil to cook kosher product, but it's cooked by a non-Jewish person, the utensil is now forbidden for use. That's what's happened. This knife, which is a fruit knife, could have also been used to cut hot fruit, let's say stewed apples, or sharp fruit, maybe lemons. And therefore, this knife has absorbed within it the product of kosher ingredients cooked by a non-Jewish person, which we established right at the beginning, halachically, according to all opinions, majority opinions, is problematic. That helps us to understand the angle, at least according to the second version of the story, that Shavar Malka came at Bati from. Don't you remember what you did last night? In other words, if you're not concerned, our issue over here is not treif. Our issue is bishul akum. And the whole premise of bishul akum is to avoid intermarriage. What were you doing last night? The whole reason to avoid eating food that is cooked solely by a non-Jewish person is to avoid socializing to the extent that you may intermarry with them. But Tosfos at least tells us that Bati doesn't have this restriction. He's actually allowed to marry those women. And then naturally, he is not forbidden to eat the food that might bring to marrying such a woman, because he's allowed to marry such a woman. Hang on a second, but we said earlier on that once something has been classified as non-kosher, it is totally non-kosher, even when the circumstances don't apply, like the planks that you want to use as schach, if you turn them on the side, well, they've been disqualified, they are disqualified, and the same thing should happen to bishul akum. As the Isur from bishul nachrim kamoy etzem ha'isur, we've already discussed that the prohibition against food cooked by a non-Jewish person makes that item as if it were absolutely forbidden. And the verbleibt der Israel dort, wo der Tam even Isur vert bottle, and that's why it would be treif even if the circumstances are not such that lend themselves to the reason we prohibited it. Is das nicht done? That's not going to apply in our case. Warum? For two reasons. First of all, let's consider was der Kral von Asakamoi etzem o Isur. If we declare that something has become as if it is fundamentally prohibited, is shayach nor when is done wegen a davar v'chefetz mit siyum. That is something you can only apply when you're trying to determine the status of an item. So here's a plank of wood. I need to know the status of this item. Does it qualify as schach or not? Well, if I put it horizontally, it's a problem because it might appear to be a roof. Therefore, this plank is no longer considered something that's viable to use for schach. As once we have named the item as disqualified, it is disqualified no matter how you play it. As the Isur is millechatchila nit chalof de zach. But if we're dealing with a scenario where logic tells us that the problem can never apply to this scenario, because this is a scenario where the whole logic behind the prohibition has no place, like ours. The whole reason not to have this kind of food is in case you marry somebody you're not allowed to marry. Well, if you are allowed to marry them, then obviously the whole logic goes out the window. Was ist nicht tot ist von bishul nachrim, der Fall was bei sei is überhaupt nicht shaykh die gzerim mishum chasnus. That's why we have a whole lot of scenarios where food that's cooked by a non-Jewish person is actually acceptable to us because it cannot in any way bring to socializing and intermarriage. But besides that, it's no siflaze. Das was die Isur bleibt euch wenn sein Sibbe v'tam vert bottle. The principle that if the logical reason to make something asur doesn't apply, and yet we'll still consider the item asur, Mit Noras ist nicht talking chash, als die Bishul Nachem kennen der Führen zum Isachasnus, aber der zum Isachasnus ist dort voran. So the logic is this: he has a foodstuff that is never going to bring Jew A to hang out with non-Jew Y. It's not going to happen. However, the problem of Jew A marrying non-Jew Y exists. So therefore, this particular food may not lead to their fraternizing, but because this food belongs to the prohibition, which is relevant to this Jewish person, therefore this food is prohibited to this Jewish person. That's not the case with Bati. There is nothing to restrict him against marrying this Persian woman. So there's no logic to then say, as based the inyan von chassus mreisen is da davar hamutar, in a scenario where marrying that girl is allowed for this guy. But we're not going to allow him to eat the food which might bring him to marry this girl. Well, that wouldn't make any sense. He's allowed to marry the girl. That's according to Tosfos' view. Now we can even explain a similar thing from Rashi's perspective, who says Bati was not allowed to be with that Persian girl during the night. So then what is Shavar Malka saying to him? The exact opposite. As Bati is given Osur ben Nachris. If you go with Rashi's view that Bati is not permitted to be with a non-Jewish woman, Chach is given an Evet Ketas despite his partial emancipation from slavery and yet partial being a slave. But bald as the Issa from Bishul Nachem is not to Fahidin from Bnei Sehen, if the whole purpose of avoiding food cooked by a non-Jewish person is to create a barrier to marriage, hat gehalten, as es nicht talking time, wer hechach zu oisit in Batem von dem Siog zum Issa Bnei Sehen. Well, the Shavar Malka in his mind says, I have no reason to create that barrier for you, seeing as you already crossed the line last night with such a woman. So why am I going to protect you now from the food that might lead you to such a woman when you've already been with such a woman? And then, with this in mind, let's go back to the first version. The first version is, what did Shavar Malka focus on? I don't know who you are. I don't know your standards. Why, according to that version, Shavar Malka does not bring up what had happened the previous night. Because while we always talk about the prohibition against eating food cooked by a non-Jewish person as being a barrier to intermarriage, there is another reason too. It's for anochatam. And Rashi quotes this reason. The Torah does not want us to eat regularly with non-Jewish people because then there's a great chance that we'll end up eating non-kosher. Because we'll just be used to eating, we'll kind of let our guard down. So perhaps the two versions of what issue Shavar Malka addressed with Bati aligns with these two possibilities of why we shouldn't be eating food cooked by a non-Jewish person. In other words, the two versions really debate which of the two reasons against eating food cooked by a non-Jewish person is the primary reason. According to the second version, well, the primary reason you're not supposed to eat bishul akum is to avoid intermarriage. Therefore, Shavar Malka in that version focuses on that part of the story. Remember what happened last night? Who were you with last night? Either according to Tosfos, meaning you're okay, you don't have to worry about bishul akum, or according to Rashi, you've already crossed that bridge, it's not going to help to keep you away from bishul akum. Why, according to but the first version of the story believes that the main reason we avoid bishul akum is for the other reason, to avoid eating with non-Jewish people, lest we mistakenly eat non-kosher. So if that's what we're concerned about, is the inyan from of das beurta nit ken entfer, then what happened the previous night between Bati and the Persian women is irrelevant to the question of whether or not he should be allowed to eat the piece of esrog offered to him by Shavar Malka. Es bleibt aber nicht verstanden, Kanal, but there's still a question. Leuten, according to the first view, which is, I don't know how frum you are. So why does Shavah Malka then say, I'm going to judge you as less frum? What would the reason be that Shavah Malka, because he's not sure if Bati is frum enough, feel that he's justified to actually present him with an opportunity to transgress a law of the Torah? And actually, for that matter, the second version of the story, which is that Bati justifies himself and says, well, you already messed up last night, in Rashi's view. Okay, we get it. Rashi says Bati was not supposed to be with a Persian woman the night before. He did it, so he doesn't really care about intermarriage. Therefore, Shavah Malka doesn't have to protect him from the things that may lead to intermarriage. Es wird doch fortgehen besser, wenn es macht dem Sacken bekarka schneit dem Messer verbaten. But you know what? It still would have been better to kasher the knife. Like, what's the downside? So you'll protect him from a different avera. He didn't avera last night. So what? Still protect him. But baldas is nit verbunden mit kein shum tircha. Ultimately, he's sticking the knife in the ground anyway. What's the difference to do it 1 minute earlier or 1 minute later? It's not going to be extra bother on his behalf. Why doesn't Shavah Malka protect him? Oh, because we're forgetting for a second what kings are or are not supposed to do. Is there beer and them a fascinating explanation, because the din is, as I punished in Isman al Tzibur, if a person is appointed to a communal position, he's not allowed to do menial labor in the presence of 3 or more people, because he has to keep a certain dignity in the community. And if that's true of a communal leader, it is certainly true of a king. You'll say, yeah, but that's halacha. Halacha applies to Jewish kings, and Shavah Malka is a non-Jewish king. Yes, but this is halacha that has a logical basis. And if halacha has a logical basis, you apply it where the logic applies. This logic applies even if the king is non-Jewish, and it certainly is logic that the king should apply to himself, because there's a sound reason why a king should remain aloof and dignified. And besides the king's choice to say, I'm not going to do work in front of you ordinary people, we as ordinary people have a responsibility halachically to show honor even to a non-Jewish king. And the reason why? Because showing proper respect to authority, particularly to a king, is valuable and relevant for the well-being of the whole world, because the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos tells us, because if people did not have that awe of the leadership, the kingship, then people would literally turn to anarchy and destroy each other. Even non-Jewish people have the responsibility of Yeshuvah Shel Olam, make the world a habitable, dignified place. And therefore, as Jewish people, we are required to show honor to a king, which means if Mar Yehuda and Bati Bar Tuvi are sitting in front of Shavah Malka, it is inappropriate for them to expect that he's going to start slicing lemon for them, certainly that he's going to start kashering a knife for them. Kommt aus, as mitzad kvoid melech, at Shavah Malka nit getort noit sein dem Sakin bekarka, bifnei Bati Mar Yehuda. So, by rights, being a king, not only was Shavah Malka excused from kashering the knife on their behalf, he wasn't permitted to do the menial job of kashering a knife in front of ordinary citizens. Now, if Bati eats this sliced esrog from Shavah Malka, he's actually not breaking the law because he's partially an Eved. And the whole issue is that he shouldn't marry a non-Jewish woman. He's allowed to marry a non-Jewish woman. In fact, Bati Bar Tuvi has no excuse not to eat this esrog. He is required to eat it to protect his own life. So actually, Shavah Malka is required by the laws of logic as well as the laws of Torah to give him the esrog without kashering the knife, because it's beneath his dignity to kasher the knife for a guy who doesn't really need the knife kashed. Whereas, when it comes to Mar Yehuda, Shavar Malka, who is not supposed to do menial labor in front of ordinary citizens, Dafka kashas the knife. Why? Because he knows exactly who he is dealing with. Who's he dealing with? Not just a frum Jew. Der Metat nicht gemeint, dass man der Mar Yehuda ist sicher, als wird nicht essen at var Isser, und man der Botten ist bei Masafik. He wasn't just simply saying, Shavar Malka, I know that Mar Yehuda is not going to eat something which isn't kosher, but Bati, I don't know about you. He knows exactly who he's dealing with Mar Yehuda. As Mar Yehuda vet b'shum oifen nit essen dem esrog. He knows that this Mar Yehuda is somebody who under no circumstances will compromise his standards, and he's not going to eat this esrog. Even if the halacha requires him to protect his own life. He is so dedicated to his Yiddishkeit, he will even put his life on the line not to eat the piece of esrog cut with a knife that is gi'ulei, or in this case, bishulei akum. Especially when you consider that Mar Yehuda is most likely Rav Yehuda, about whom the Gemara Brochas tells us, the Gemara asks the question, how come it is that Rav Yehuda was, whatever he davened for, even before he davened, he could create miracles, bring rain, etc. So the Gemara says, why? Because he was one of those original sages who were willing to give their lives for Kiddush Hashem, for Hashem's purposes. Even when they were not required. Shavar Malka must have known this. It was a well-known thing. This is Rav Yehuda. He does not compromise his principles even on pain of death. So now, the same Shavar Malka who is not permitted to kasher the knife of Bati ben Tuvi, because I don't know if he's of the standard or if he has the requirement, and I'm a king, I don't have to do manual labor, I'm not allowed to do manual labor for such a person. That same Shavar Malka looks at Rav Yehuda and says, and here is somebody who's willing to die for his principles, I am required to kasher the knife for him. But Bati, I don't know who I'm dealing with. Nitzier is v'chlal porish von Yisurim chas v'shalom ablois su Bati vetzech moise nefesh zayin of them. It's not even a question of how frum Bati is. Maybe he's a really frum guy, but he's not necessarily going to lay down his life for this mitzvah. He's not allowed to kasher the knife for him. And that gives us a massive lesson in Avodah Zara. Von dem Sipur hat man in Avodah Zara. Da wird erzählt, als Shavar Malka seien gesessen zwei Menschen. Here's a story. Two people sitting in front of a king. Both of those people have an equal responsibility to show respect and honor to the king. Einer von sie ist gewesen in Schreck vor dem nitidischen Melech, und der Pharao hatte gegessen von der Pri, was Shavar Malka hat geschnitten mit nicht kosheren Sacken. One of the two people was completely awestruck by the fact that he's sitting in front of a king, and therefore he was willing to eat something which is technically not kosher because it was cut with a knife which shouldn't be used for a Jewish person. And why would he do it? He defended it based on halachic principles which say you're not required to die for a piece of esrog. So that Jew who has the willingness to compromise his values can find an halachic loophole. The king doesn't have major respect for him. Und der zweite, the second Jew, was bei Shavar Malka ist gewesen, Kimle begavei, wird nicht über sein Knissa viele, wenn das Riton Kved HaMelech Bismes ist Nefesh. But when Shavar Malka detects that the other Jew sitting in front of him is somebody who will not devalue his principles, even in front of a king, even if it's at risk to his life, darf der dat nicht mehr nicht verloren dem Chen BaMelech. Not only did that Jew not offend the king, aber Shavar Malka allein hat mewarte gewinnt in seinem Kved Malchus, und hat sich allein Matchiach gewinnt zum Meshame sein Mar Yehuda. Shavar Malka's response to him is not to snap his fingers and call a servant to kasher the knife, but to personally kasher the knife on Rabbi Yehuda's behalf. Der Chayra hat doch gekannt, reinrufen, einen von dem Mishas HaMelech und ihm heißen Neut sein, dem Sachen Bekarke. He could have snapped his fingers and called for an aid. He could have even given the knife to Mar Yehuda and said, listen, I know you need to kasher this, go ahead, do your thing. But he did it himself. Why? When a non-Jewish person sees a Jew who has absolute awe of Hashem, A Jew who will avoid what is transgression to the nth, to the point of Mesiras Nefesh. Then the non-Jewish person considers it an honor, even if he's the king. It's the honor for a king to serve such a person. Not only to serve him, how much to what extent will he help this Jewish person? What he considered his honor and privilege to help this Jewish person? Even to do things which are only, so to speak, hidur, not required by law, because by law you could say it's not something you have to fight about on pain of death. This is the final story in Masechta Avodah Zara, because this is the siyum. This is how you end the chokehold of Avodah Zara in our world. When we stand up strong, absolutely unwavering in our commitment to Judaism, that destroys the Avodah Zara in our world. And then the Eibishter can be clearly the king, the sole king over the entire world. And the Eibishter will be declared and recognized as king over the whole of existence, B'Karev Mamish, the coming of Mashiach now.